Welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. This episode going to be giving an update on my season so far and talking in-season scouting. All right, welcome to the Am I Hunting Podcast. Thank you for listening again. So this episode, we're in November. It's the time that every deer hunter is looking forward to. The rut has been going on. At least that's what I've been told anyways. I've been having one heck of a season so far where I've been really, swinging and missing really throughout most of the season, if not primarily in this late season where I've really been struggling apparently over the past couple of years of getting on deer during the early part of the season. So I've been relying more so on the later part, so late October and into November. Even this year, I've been struggling to get on any deer. So I've yet to lay eyes on a single buck that I would be considered to be a shooter. And it's not for lack of trying. I've got areas that do have some really good bucks, primarily one that I've been really focusing on, but I've yet to be able to, get into, the swing of it where I'm actually, sitting the same time that these bucks are coming through. Now, a few weeks back, I did manage to harvest a doe down at the private piece I hunt. So that, again, sitting over the food plot, knowing that was going to be a hot commodity for the evening hunt. Ended up sitting in there. Did have some smaller 1.5-year-old bucks come out, and then a group of does as well that came out a little bit later after the bucks took off. Group of 4 came out with a couple fawns, and I think even a button buck was with them there. They came across from the food plot all the way over to my side where I was sitting in my blind. Put a 20-yard shot on her, and that ended up kind of working out to where I end up, if you remember, episode with Calvin Dennis, who's a tracker with his dog. He actually, I just gotten done doing an interview with him a couple days prior, and ended up having to give him a call. So essentially what ended up happening is the doe came in, it was about 22, 23 yards, put a shot on her, and ultimately, I wasn't able to exactly determine what the point of impact was. When she was running away, I saw the backside where the shot looked a bit back. I did see some blood coming out, but it was very slow. Definitely looked like part liver. So I ended up having to give him a call. Now, a couple things with that. So the doe was slightly quartering to me. So I knew that I was going to get a little bit further back. So I tried hugging that shoulder. But basically, even at the 20 yards I have, I shoot a very large, 3.5-inch orange vein. I also run lighted nocks, and even with that, I didn't see where the point of impact. I didn't even see my nock. Essentially, I didn't see where the arrow hit. Now, part of that was, I think, partially by the design or my choice of broadheads. So I basically went with a very heavy 3-blade that has 1 1/8 cut. So I'll show it to you here. So essentially, this is the broadhead. So as you can see, it's got a very steep angle for the blades. Hold that still there. Again, 200 grain, and this is a solid one piece. Again, from Vantage Point Archery, I've started using their heads this year. So this is the one that I had on my arrow setup initially. And what ended up happening was on the shot, basically ended up getting in between 2 different ribs. So I shot in between the ribs, and on the backside I clipped one rib, but I didn't actually cut all the way through it, just clipped it. So basically the arrow that I was shooting with this broadhead, now again my total arrow weight is about 580 grains. So basically this, that arrow met 0 resistance aside from soft tissue all the way through the deer. So basically I found the arrow buried in the dirt. I didn't even know where my arrow was initially until I had to do a little bit of scouring and found it, buried in the dirt into the plants of the food plot there. So ultimately, didn't know the point of impact. Saw that the exit hole was back, showing liver, which indicated that I was going to have to wait it out to recover her. It started to rain as well, so I had that going against me. At the point of impact, there was blood at the site, but there was no, sign of any blood outside of that initial impact zone. With that, gave Calvin a call, told him, kind of where I thought the impact was, where the exit hole was, how she took off, the direction she took off. Ultimately, we decided that it was best to let her sit, anticipating that it was a liver shot. She's going to need several hours. Ultimately, it would have came out to about 6 to 8 hours. It would have put us at like 3, 4 in the morning by the time we got out there. So ultimately, we decided to go out there next morning. Picked up the track right at the point of impact, and Willow, his dog, she took off like she had no question about where that deer went. She stuck her nose right in the track where that deer was standing and immediately took off to the direction she went. Now, she did end up going down a different trail than what the deer ended up going with. And Calvin explained to me that basically that was the downwind side of that trail. So basically Willow was trying to, get in a spot where she was going to pick up as much of the scent as she could, following downwind of where the deer actually was. Sure enough, we actually traveled about 180, 190 yards total with the dog. But ultimately, the deer had made it about 130 yards off the food plot, piled up, had probably been dead for quite a while because the coyotes ended up getting the back end of her. So lost essentially both hind ends and part of the backstrap and whatnot. But, it was one of those deals where I didn't have good sign of, being able to maintain the track on her. So, basically without knowing exactly how or my exact shot placement was and no blood to follow, I think it ultimately made the right call to back out and wait it out until Calvin could come and assist. Basically I would have been going in just based on what the direction of the travel was of the deer, and that was about it for sign until potentially until I just stumbled upon the deer or found a bed or something like that. So ultimately, we got the deer out, and as I started getting her gutted out and whatnot, did a bit of an autopsy, and sure enough, the shot was a little bit better than we thought. Initially, it was a little bit back, it was a little high, but looking at the organs and whatnot, ended up clipping both, or essentially getting both lungs, hit the back of both lungs, and then clipped the liver as well. So Calvin wasn't wrong when he said that it was liver, and he even said that a lot of times if you go through the liver, even after you've gone through, lung and whatnot, that you're going to pick up a lot of that material from the liver, and it's going to hide some of the other sign from the rest of the deer. So, and then after I got the deer taken care of, I did backtrack what essentially looked like what was the trail that she took, and it was kind of it was a good learning experience, and I learned a little bit more about after knowing exactly how the shot went, what the shot placement looked like, what the internal damage was on the deer. Ultimately I could have probably gone after that deer right away, based on the actual what the actual shot was and how far the deer made it off to. But at the time, not knowing, like I said, about the actual shot placement and not having any good blood to follow, even walking it the next day, there was, most of the blood was washed away, but it would have been tough to find any blood anyways, because there's most of it was still in the chest cavity, being that higher shot on the body. A lot of the blood pooled up inside the deer and wasn't spraying out like you would like to see for a good blood trail. And the only other blood that I really did find is that it looks like she did bump into a tree, and some of it got on the side of the tree there, so it was a pretty good spot on the tree. But outside of that, again, not any significant blood, even through going through the thicker cover. So big thanks to Calvin for coming out and, putting some, putting my mind at ease, being able to be successful at finding that deer almost right away. I think it took Willow, I think he timed it out. It took her 6 minutes to get on the deer from when she started. So it's amazing to see what those dogs can do. And even after the significant rain that we got, she was on it. She was almost at the point where we had to kind of jog behind her just to keep up. So, having that resource, having someone available, especially if you have to wait it out, or if you're unsure about how far the deer made it, or if you got spotty sign and you don't want to start, having to rely on grid searching and just trying to stumble upon the deer by chance. Calling in a dog tracker is just going to be another great resource to help you if you do need help recovering your deer. So after that, with that broadhead, with it being the 1 1/8 cut, there is a little bit to be said about if I had a bigger cut, would it had developed more of a blood trail? Now, I certainly think that the weight of my arrow and the design of this broadhead, I have no shortage of potential for penetration. Even though, in this shot, in this instance on this deer, I didn't hit any significant bone. The fact that it basically flew through her as if she wasn't even there is a strong indication that, with the design of this broadhead, and if I would have had a little bit better shot placement, if I would have got more into that vital V or hugged that shoulder, gotten into that shoulder a little bit better, closer to the heart, that I probably would have had, I got a feeling that the deer probably wouldn't have even made it off as nearly as far, and I probably would have had a lot easier blood trailing as well. So a bit on my part for partially bad shot placement. Now, basically with the how close the deer was and how high the shot ended up being, I do think that she did end up ducking the string a little bit. So, just before taking the shot, she did have her front leg back. So I was waiting out for her to take one more step. But one thing I didn't think about in the moment was that, she had her head down and eating, and I wish I would have thought about it because, it was fresh in my mind only a few days prior, where I was watching a video from Dr. Grant Wood about talking about when to shoot, or basically how a deer drops. So they notice a significant difference when a deer has its head up compared to when it has its head down. So when it has its head down, basically it's able to drop and spring load into those that lunge a little bit. So basically it drops down, loads up those muscles on the legs. That way it can bound away, or do a quick turn or bounce and get out of there. So when they had their head down, it at least from what they were observing, is that it allows them to be able to drop a little bit faster, a little bit further. Whereas compared to if they have their head up, then they can't usually basically, as they already have their head up, so it's harder for them to drop down to be able to spin out of it. When they have their head down, basically they're saying as their shoulders drop, their head raises up, and then they can able to, bolt out of there a little bit easier. So I do think that doe did drop a little bit, and basically I think that's partially what could have happened when the shot ended up higher than I had, or basically my endpoint was. But you know what? Again, it comes down to that's deer hunting. Things happen. I could have just botched a shot a little bit and had ended up hitting higher than I aimed, even if that deer hadn't dropped. So it was a good learning experience. Got some meat in the freezer, even though I lost some of it because of the coyotes. But that's how it goes. So, in speaking of deer harvest, I wanted to touch base on this a little bit. So, as most of everyone knows, if not everyone should know at this point, that the DNR has started a mandatory reporting of deer harvest. So again, that's primarily the thing that is done is online and whatnot. So with that deer, I did go through that registration process. And, it's pretty simple. One thing I know that a lot of people got hung up on is about the exact location of the deer harvest that people are noticing. They're making comment on, especially on social media, about why the DNR need to know the exact location. Well, basically what it comes down to is that, especially if you're doing it on your phone, one of the easiest ways to pinpoint a location is to go off your GPS. So if you're doing anything, if you're doing scouting, if you're basically looking for directions, if you're looking for a restaurant nearby or something like that, the easiest way to pinpoint where you are and how to get directions to anything is through your phone GPS. So seems like what's going on in regards to the reporting. That's why it's using the exact location. Now, going through that, it basically asks you a lot of the same questions you would on the typical survey, or if you would go on and taking your deer to a check station. So, age of the deer, sex, that type of thing. If it was a buck, I'm sure they're going to ask you a number of points and everything like that. But aside from that, they don't get into too much detail. And then, so the next thing I want to do is actually take a look at the actual harvest report. So that's actually up to date. Basically, it's real time essentially for the most part. So with this, again, I'm gonna do some imagery from here on out throughout the most of the podcast. So if I'm going to try to explain it as best I can in detail for those who are just listening. But if you want to take a look at the imagery or see what I'm looking at as well, I'll also link the harvest report, or how you get to the harvest report as well, so you can take a look at it yourself. Basically, so what we're looking at with it is it does a breakdown of the harvest. So it really is not going to be as detailed as even what the questionnaires tell you. Basically it's going to be the same type of data that you would get generally at the end of the season or spring of the next year, about basically the harvest report of the number of animals per county, whether they were buck or doe. And that's really about it. At least that's all they initially have on the report. So you can actually break it down based on type of season. So if you want to look at the Liberty Youth, all right, so we can even go into the Liberty Hunt, do a breakdown by county. So we're just going to take a look at the total of all the seasons so far and do an overall breakdown. All right, so for this, it actually gives you a timestamp of the total report so far. So as of today at 5:25 p.m., there's been 73,559 deer harvested for the state so far. So again, it goes down basically breaking down each county alphabetically, and then the number of antlered deer versus antlerless deer. Now, one thing that's really interesting that I've noticed is that there's some counties that are pretty much almost a 50-50 split of does to bucks, and then there's others that are very skewed towards the buck side. So I know that the DNR especially is looking at those ratios. So, basically the DNR will tell you, as well as the National Deer Association, that essentially they're looking for close to about a 1-to-1 ratio, a 1-to-1 ratio of bucks to does taken throughout the season. In general, if you look at, fawns that are dropped in the spring, basically if you were to do a general count of all the fawns for the year that were born, then you should see relatively close to a 1-to-1 ratio as well. That's partially why they want to see the harvest averaged out about the same. Basically, that's the number of fawns you start out with, and then they're looking to have that same ratio roughly taken of deers taken off the landscape as well. So basically, it keeps everything in balance from the fawns being dropped to the deer being taken at the end of the year. So there's some counties that are pretty good about being 50-50. There's others that are definitely skewed more on the buck side. So, and again, a lot of this has to do, this breakdown will have a lot to do with overall deer numbers as well. So, and in general too, a lot of these areas that have much higher, harvest reported are definitely going to be areas that are known to have a higher population of deer as well. So you can basically look at your county, see kind of what their breakdown is, and you can kind of get an idea for the overall of the state overall. Now, one thing I do kind of wish that they would do is kind of do like a total of either. So we just have the total of both there. I would like to see if they actually did a bit of the ratio comparison, and then a total of each for all the counties as well. But again, this is something that's brand new that I kind of want to highlight a little bit, so people kind of knew what your data from your harvest report is leaning into. Now, of course, the DNR is going to take some more of that detailed information and do a compile a little bit more detailed report. I typically know that the National Deer Association, for their annual deer report, they actually do a breakdown of each county based on age group. So for bucks and does, they'll actually take a breakdown of what the reported ages were, and you actually get a breakdown of the age groups, or the percentage of each age group of deer that were harvested. So that's usually what I'm most interested in, is basically, especially in the counties that I hunted, is looking at the number of deer that are taken in my area, what the ratio was to buck to doe, and then also what the age breakdown of those deer are as well. So typically, in years past, for a lot of the state, you're looking at the vast majority of 1.5-year-old bucks that were taken. Now there's been a gradual shift to where now I think only about a third of all the total deer taken out of the state are 1.5 years or younger, or at least for bucks anyway. So we're starting to see a shift in the age group of the deer being taken. So, and I think that's an overall good thing. We're starting to see older class deer, bigger bucks, and they're going to be something that a lot of people have been trying for. A lot of the QDMA type practices is starting to kind of pay off, I think, in that regard, where we're starting to get a little bit more balanced age breakdown of the deer throughout the state. Now, there's probably some areas that probably still need a lot of work, but we are seeing where we're starting to see a breakdown of the buck to doe ratio. Still needs some more too, but at least now some of the older buck age groups are getting represented throughout the population. All right, so as I said before, I've been struggling with my season so far. I started out, hadn't scouted quite a bit. I found some new spots and kind of scouted more on areas that I had hunted in the past and wanted to get a little bit more information on. Went into it early season, and I again was batting zero. A lot of the spots that showed promise, based on the historical sign or some of the sign that I was seeing, ultimately didn't really produce anything that I was hoping for. So again, I ended up trying to rely more on the late October, so that pre-rut time frame, catching some of those bucks are starting to cruise more. And even that, I've been struggling to, like I said, get on a deer that's worth, or at least one that I've actually been able to encounter yet in a hunting scenario. So I want to highlight one of the areas that I've been focusing on where I've gotten the most potential for getting a deer. So this is the area that ultimately I kind of, last year this wasn't a spot that I had hunted. It was just so happened that on my way home one day from work, there was a big old buck that had crossed the road and headed into this property area. So I didn't really have it scouted out or anything like that during the primary archery season. And then I really didn't even get a chance to hunt it during the main firearm season. So I ended up getting in there, in December when there was some snow on the ground. I started scouting. Basically, I started working the area, seeing where some of the main trails were, learned a little bit about it, and then proceeded this year to do some more scouting and try to learn a little bit more about the area. So ultimately, my first scouting trip, going into it, a lot of the trails, at least from what I saw from the doe family groups, is a lot of their trails are running north to south. So a lot of these orange trails that are running the length of the property, a lot of those were ones I found in the snow with those, doe family groups, especially traveling with lots of different track sizes. Definitely some fawns mixed into it. And in that scouting for this part of the property here, I did find a couple areas that had some significant rubs. So this is basically a patch of maple saplings and some other hardwood mixed in, where there's basically a group of rubs throughout this area and a couple of old scrapes. Now these scrapes, they weren't really big. They were maybe only a couple feet wide, and definitely ones that weren't really maintained all that much. As I move further south, again hit another patch. So this is just a patch of pines that had significant rubs in there, and it looked like there was a bed in there. I presumed it was a buck bed based on the thickness of the cover, the size of the bed, and that the fact that there wasn't a lot of beds within that area. There's a couple in there, and they were all relatively the same size. And then the fact that there's this group of rubs mixed right into it. I didn't anticipate that was be a doe bedding group. So then I proceeded to build my plan for hunting. So essentially what I started out with initially with my plan is to try to come in from the south. So anything with a north wind, come in here, and I really focused on this part up here initially. So basically my plan was to come up through here and get into this little patch of pines next to these hardwoods and catch anything that was coming through. So what I ended up doing is I did end up putting a couple trail cameras in. So I threw one trail camera on this scrape here, and then I threw another one down further down here a little bit later, actually in season here. So we'll go back up here and focus on the primary spot. So again, this is an area where I saw primarily a lot of the does traveling north and south. And then after I placed this camera, I basically put it on that scrape that I had found the year before. I freshened it up, added some scent in there. So I threw basically my same routine. I took some Conquest Evercalm in there, put it in the scrape, as well as some Dominant Buck scent as well, just to kind of prime it up. And wouldn't you know it, very early on, there was lots of movement. Basically, the does were getting into these hardwoods and catching and going through here, catching a lot of them on camera, and then also had several bucks that were hitting the scrape as well. Now, primarily, most of them were at night, but I did have a few, or at least primarily one, that was hitting it during daylight. So, proceeded to hunt. Essentially, I would put my tree stand right in this area. As they would come through, be within range of the scrape, and I actually had set up another mock scrape over on the left side of the cover. So basically, if they were to go on either side of the cover, I'd have basically a Y shape of being able to shoot at either one of those scrapes. So essentially, after doing that, a lot of my hunts were a lot slower than I anticipated. So again, a lot of times what I'll end up doing, especially if the wind's working in my favor, I'll do a little additional scouting. So, after sitting here with a north wind, I proceeded to continue to scout these other trails that I knew that a lot of the does were taken. So one time after a hunt, came in here and there was actually a doe bedded kind of on this little hillside next to the boundary line. So there's a little bit of a hillside, there's some ferns in there, a little bit of daylight that shows, and there was a a lone doe bedded in there. As I continue to move south, get past a lot of the other pines, and again, another bit of a clearing where some of the ferns and some of the other grasses are growing in, and found another area next to some oak saplings that there were several beds in there, indicating that it was a doe bedding area with lots of different sizes. Clearly they were using it quite often. And just up the hill from there is a patch of white oaks. Now this is an area that I didn't really had scouted out before, so I really didn't even know this was even here. But basically up on top of this little hilltop, there's a bit of an oak flat. So I have an indicator here of a mature oak with the white logo that indicates it's a white oak. Found also a historic rub in the area. And at the time I scouted it, there was actually evidence of a freshly made rub or freshly made scrape. So I scouted a little bit more, looped up a little bit further up to the northeast. And as I moved up into the more of the oak flat, I saw where there was a significant amount of browse along, certain portions of these saplings, for these oak saplings. You could basically just walk through clear as day, where you could tell that deer have been browsing. A lot of the leaves and branches of these small saplings have been eaten away, and it was basically like a runway where you could see. So they basically loop around this oak flat. So then I proceeded to put another camera on that scrape where the primary, oak trees that were definitely producers were. And with that, again, with a white oak crop, there was a good crop of white oaks. So the deer were definitely keying in on the white oaks. So definitely, as soon as I got the camera, again, right away started getting pictures of those hitting those acorns, early morning, in the evening as well. And then sure enough, got the additional pictures of bucks that are hitting that area as well, basically cruising in there. I imagine feeding on some of the acorns, and then definitely hitting that freshed up scrape that I added some additional scent to. So now I've pinpointed another spot that I want to hunt. So I ended up determining that because I'm further south, I want to focus more around this other area that had some additional food source and definitely some increased deer movement. So I proceeded to come up with a new access point, found a new tree to set up in that was basically within range of that oak tree as well as that scrape as well. I did have basically a low point where off the hilltop I could see down into the ferns and down across the property about another good 80 yards or so. So I could see if there's any additional travel north and south going past my location. So I sat there a couple of times. Again, no real significant sign of movement. I did end up encountering some additional hunting pressure that was more or less hunting the same area. So I ended up kind of backing out of that area and trying to come up with a new game plan. So from there, my game plan was to try to get at that location from the north still. So instead of coming down from the south where I knew that other hunter was potentially going to come in from, I proceeded to come from the north with a new access route. So basically I determined that I could set up on both locations, both now with a wind out of the south. So essentially came in from the far side of the property and moved into both locations. Now ultimately, both these came down to where I think they're a lot better of an access point, where I'm not going to be coming in from the south, where potentially I'm crossing a lot more deer movement and potentially leaving some ground scent for something to realize I'm there. So I come from all the way from the north, walk along the property line, and then essentially beeline it to my hunt locations. So I have one spot at the place further north. So essentially I'm now on the east side of where those rubs and scrapes are, and I can see into an opening where, again, a lot of the travel is going north and south, especially from the does. So it's set up in this other tree and actually has some pretty promising sign right away. So as I'm sitting there for an evening sit, sure enough, a doe and her fawn come through, coming from the south, cut through the hardwoods as they headed up north. Now, one thing that I hadn't anticipated, primarily for an evening sit, is I am slightly elevated above where those hardwoods are, where they would cut through. Now, it was only a slight increase in the elevation, and I figured with a good south or southwest wind that the chances for my thermals to get sucked down into that little bit of a low spot there were very minimal. Well, I learned very quickly that even if the wind dies down, or even if it's not a steady wind, my thermals did creep down into that area. So as the doe proceeded to get into this cover, before she got into the clearing, I could see her doing that old lifting her nose up and catching my scent. So at this point, she's only about 35 yards out, but again, she's noticing that there's something that she doesn't like, and that's from my thermals getting pulled down, which I later confirmed after she passed by, that I did the milkweed test, and sure enough, that milkweed was getting drawn right down in her direction where she started smelling me. So basically what she ended up doing is that she didn't completely spook out, and I do think it's partially because of my scent control regimen. I basically try to eliminate as much of my scent as possible, and I also lay down some Evercalm scent, which again is basically mimics the smell of deer. Almost like if you were in like a stall or a barn or something like that had deer in it. It just smells like a deer bedding area, and that kind of almost like that musty deer smell. So what she ended up doing, she didn't actually completely spook, but she definitely didn't like the smell. So she actually proceeded up the other side of the hill away from me. Once she started gaining some elevation again, I think she couldn't smell me anymore because she was above my thermals that were getting sucked down into that little bowl there. And she went out about 50 yards out and just proceeded to go north still. So I learned that spot may not be a good location for an evening sit, just because of those thermals getting pulled down potentially. Now, it could still work if you had a good steady wind that would continue to pull your scent away. But if you had any time where the wind died down, like it often does in the evening, your scent could get pulled down into that low spot. So that spot is more I determined to be more of a morning location. So even though that lower spot, as the morning begins to warm up, a lot of those thermals are going to get pulled up or sucked uphill, or even pulled up into the atmosphere and not settle down into that bowl. So that location, or for that exact spot, I do have figured out a little bit better. Now I do think I am going to switch to a different tree that's just a few yards away, that's going to give me a better opportunity to shoot on both sides of that thick hardwood cover, where I have a little bit better sight into these pines. But that will be for another time. Now the other area that I wanted to focus on even more is further to the south, where these oaks were. A lot of the trail camera data was showing that there's a lot more activity further down in this location, and the fact that with all these significant oaks in the area, I knew that was an area that had a lot more draw to it, simply because of the good food source. So the next spot that I tried or looked into was getting down further into where these oaks were. Now the problem is most of this is all the saplings and whatnot, where it's so heavily dense in there that it's hard to move in there without causing a bunch of noise and ruckus. And potentially there's deer bedded in there, these little pockets where there's a little bit of openings within the oaks. A deer could be bedded down in there. So I was very cautious about wanting to come in here. But again, as we got into November, basically decided to be a little more aggressive. So I came out of my spot from the north, managed to cut through as best I could through these oak saplings and set up in this pine tree. It's basically kind of in the middle of the oaks, really, of a lot of these oak saplings. You've got mature oaks off to the east, and then back down the main pocket of mature oaks down to the southwest as well. So the idea was basically to be able to shoot anything that would come off the adjacent property. So the idea was to try to catch anything that was coming off this adjacent property to the east. There's some significant pines. There is a little bit uphill from my location. There is this open field on the adjacent property as well. I don't think that's actually doing anything. From being able to use binoculars and look into this field, it's basically a dried out field. So it basically looks like an old CRP type field, or maybe an old, I don't know, something that is all dry. It's nothing green in there. But based on the travel movement that a lot of the bucks are doing, so a lot of the does I observe would be traveling more north and south on this property, around the property I'm hunting. A lot of the buck movement was more east to west. So I anticipate that a lot of the bucks are coming off of these thicker pines, cutting across the private ground, and then into this public land where I'm hunting. So the goal was to try to get in here on this pine tree and catch these bucks as they're coming off the adjacent property into these oaks. Now, one thing that I haven't been this being the first time really getting in here from this direction, I didn't really anticipate that based on where I had my camera and the angle where the deer were actually approaching after doing some further analysis of the pictures, the deer were actually coming out further to the north on this main trail instead of coming down in front from the south where I had initially thought the bucks would be primarily coming from. So I realized after scouting it one more time and looking at my pictures again that these bucks are cutting up and going north of this tree. So me coming in with anything with a south wind, these bucks would get downwind of me. So especially if they were coming through from the east and coming from the east heading to the southwest, they were cutting behind me and potentially going to catch my wind. And with this thicker cover that's behind me, I wouldn't have even seen the buck before they even catch wind of me, probably bug out without me even knowing. So with that additional information from my cameras, as well as having scouted the area again and realizing that the primary trail is potentially further north than what I thought, I decided to change my game plan a little bit again. So ultimately, as you can see now, I've got these new stands marked. Basically one that comes in from the north and one that comes in from the south. So the idea here is, again, if anything with a south wind, especially if it's out of the southwest where it's blowing my scent basically in the direction of my access route, I can set up on this pine tree here, still within shooting range of that main trail. I can see across to these other mature oaks, as well as I can see into these pines and potentially get a shot on another one of the main trails that a lot of the doe movement comes down. So it's a much better setup where I can still be quite aggressive and shoot within the main trails I anticipate a lot of the deer movement is coming from. But then also I'm not getting into the vast majority of the cedars, or not cedars, I'm not getting into the vast majority of those oak saplings, getting into where potentially there's going to be a deer bedded in there or, holed up in this thicker cover. And then because I don't want to be limited on the wind direction and when I can get in there, the next location again is coming from the south. So basically pick the next closest tree that's south of the main trail and that primary oak spot. So this one's a little bit trickier. It would be a little bit further shot. So if anything does come further south of my initial pine tree that I picked, that would be a nice close shot there. For this other trail to the north, we're looking at a further distance. So actually what that distance would be, let's say if they were all the way up in here, that's a 38-yard shot, so not bad. So I could still shoot that main trail that's further north, heading into those oak saplings, as well as I'm covered further south if they come in short of that trail as well. Again, coming from the south, anything with a north wind, especially if it's a northwest wind where it blows more into the front part of this private piece, that I can slip in and out without the deer winding me. So that's the spots there. I am gonna continue to run cameras here probably for another week or so before rifle season. Once rifle season kicks off, I'm gonna pull my cameras just in the event that someone decides to get some sticky fingers and try to take my cameras out. I can pull them out of there. So I am going to try to hunt these areas a couple more times because I did have basically the big 9 point that I've been primarily trying to focus on. He came through this last Friday, and it was at 10:40 a.m. So basically I missed him by a day. I actually went out the following day and ended up pulling the cards from the cameras that next morning and realized that he was up cruising. Even with this warmer temperatures, he was out moving around. So another indication I think that is something is going to be focusing on in this area is the one doe that I saw with her fawn. I went out just the other morning and realized and saw that she was out roaming around and her fawn was nowhere to be found. So either her fawn got killed somehow or she's becoming receptive and has kicked her fawn to the side as she's getting prepared to be bred. So this area still has some great potential. It's taken me a long time to figure it out. Hopefully with some of the mistakes that I made, that I didn't bugger up the area and announce my presence too much to those mature bucks. So yeah, I still got some potential, and before the Orange Army comes out to try to get one of these bucks with my bow. So this is just kind of a recap. Again, I really love doing in-season scouting. I love using this mapping system. So this is Hunt Stand. You know, one of the ones I've used the longest for a mapping system for hunting. It does give me the most options in regards to being able to color coordinate. It also allows me to basically pinpoint any type of sightings I've had or harvest, and you can actually collect data on this, so you can actually build a track record or trends of different times you've encountered deer, different harvest times, so you can actually look at time of day of the month, temperature, barometric pressure, wind direction, wind speed, and you can actually start looking at trends to see when you've seen the most movement, when you've seen the most deer, as well as you can also track and keep track of your trail camera pictures within the software as well. So a lot of good features with it to be able to collect all your data and build that bigger picture. So you're basically taking all these different puzzle pieces together and using it to be able to pinpoint a plan of attack on how to address these areas. And again, a lot of times when I end up having a bad sit or things aren't going as I thought, I get down, I start scouting more to try to learn more as well. Basically the same thing that happened this spot further to the south where these acorns were. You know, if I didn't put forth the effort and scout it ahead of time, then I wouldn't have been able to, you know, move into an area where that's going to be a little bit higher potential to catch up with one of the bucks. So if I would have caught it in this next season, you know, doing scouting this next spring or after season, it would have been too late for this year. It's another good way to catch any potential, you know, the freshest sign. If you walk an area that you've scouted in the past, or even a new area. If you find something fresh, like a fresh scrape, a fresh rub, something like that, or especially a fresh food source that's really hot, that's the time to move into it and try to capitalize. So, with this, I'm trying to get this area figured out. I'm trying to get these bucks figured out. I am catching on to the fact that I'm trying to punch above my weight class when trying to go after some of these more mature bucks. I'm making quite a few mistakes learning these new areas, but ultimately I'm taking the best knowledge I got on hand, making the best decision, and trying to move in and capitalize the best I can and learning as I go. So that's one of the big keys I really wanted to make sure that, or hope that you take away from this, and kind of looking at the breakdown of one of the properties that I've been focused on, my thought process of how attacking the area, and some of the resources I use to keep track of it all as well. So with that, I went on a little long, kind of bounced around a little bit about some of my ideas. Hopefully you're able to follow along. If you're just listening, again, if you wanted to have the visual of what I was talking about, head on over to my YouTube channel or head on over to Rumble. Again, that's MI Hunting Podcast, and you can actually watch the video and look at the actual mapping that I was talking about to get a better idea of what the lay of the land of what I'm looking at as well. So again, it is the first week of November right now. The rut is still going on. I've gotten pictures of bucks cruising in the middle of the day, even though I haven't been able to catch up with any of them yet. They are up on their feet. They are cruising. So now's the time to stay a little bit longer in the stand. And again, this is the time of year where even if you're not seeing deer, if there's no action in you, it can change in a heartbeat. I hope that you're able to get out there. We do have a cold front moving in. Well, a bit of a cold front anyways. We're going to get about a 10-degree drop here in the next few days. So hopefully, again, that helps us with that daytime movement, gets those bucks feeling a little more frisky, wanting to run around during the daytime. So I hope you have a chance to get out there over the next week or so before rifle season starts. And with that, this is a wrap. So as always, get out there, be safe, and have fun.